The room was way quieter than I expected. Just the shaky flicker of the projector threw these jumpy shadows all over the pale walls of the lecture hall. Rows and rows of eyes were glued to me, not blinking, kinda shimmering with this weird mix of fascination and, unease. Someone coughed, all nervous, like somewhere in the middle. Then a chair creaked, one of those old bolted down ones, a real sharp, scratchy sound that cut right through the quiet, except for the rain, which was just hammering against the windows like crazy. I glanced down at the flash drive in my hand. Just a bit of plastic and metal, right? But in that dim light, it caught a glint, and suddenly it felt like I was holding Pandora's box or something. I gripped it tighter, straightened up, trying to ignore the ache in my knees and back, from too many hours hunched over lab benches. Too many sleepless nights staring at data I honestly wished I could just burn now. The mic on the podium gave a little whine as I breathed into it. They were all waiting for something. Hope, maybe, or a story that would get them hyped up, scandalized, something they could post online and forget by tomorrow morning. But they wouldn't forget this. None of us would, I imagined. What I'm about to tell you, I started, my voice feeling way too low. It's not some fairy tale. It's a straight-up nightmare. And we created it. The words just hung there. I saw movement in the front row, a girl, maybe early 20s, notebook shaking in her hands, pen frozen above the page. Next to her, a guy from some local news outlet. I recognized the logo on his jacket. His camera was already rolling, that tiny red light blinking like the end of a cigarette in the dark. In the silence, everything else just got louder. The buzz of that dodgy fluorescent tube at the back of the room was like screaming all of a sudden. The smell of wet coats and damp leather was thick in the air, mixed with this faint, metallic tang of stale coffee from some abandoned cup. I slid the flash drive into the USB port on the ancient laptop on the podium. For a split second, I hesitated. Most people think they want the truth, right? But the reality is, it messes you up. I tapped the keyboard a couple of times, bringing an image up on the screen behind me. Grainy photo. The room took this collective breath like whoosh. This was the first one, I said. 2008. Pale, shriveled thing half buried in the sand of the Mariana Trench. Deep sea drone footage. All hazy, bits of debris floating around. Floodlights cutting through the dark, showing just enough. Long bony tail. Someone back then joked about rips. And the face of half crushed, but still unmistakably human-like. A shiver went through the room, like a wave. I was there, I said, my voice quiet. The start of it all. That corpsey, that's how it began. I was part of a team they threw together, oceanographers, biologists, chemists, geneticists. Nothing about it made sense at the time, but it changed everything. I heard chairs shifting again, nervous muttering, quiet, not yet loud. Someone whispered, like they didn't want me to hear, "That's fake." I met the reporter's eyes for a second. "Good," I said out loud. "They need to be scared? Fear's their shield." I took a breath, focused on the room again. We weren't the only ones, see? That's what they didn't tell you. The Russians, they found theirs first. Years before this, we even suspected the Chinese had bits and pieces of something similar. Weh. I gestured vaguely. The Americans, we stumbled in late, around 2012. It wasn't about discovery anymore by then. It was about weapons. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Mermaid isn't really the right word for them. I went on. Easy things. Yeah, we started there, with the mermaid thing. But it's misleading. These aren't myths, not bedtime stories. They're adaptations, aberrations, parasitic life, found to survive in places so dark, so hostile, we used to think nothing could live there. Elegance. Nah, there's none of that, just hunger. I scanned the faces in the audience, pale, tense, silent. And they are not extinct. A beat, 2 beats. We made sure of that. Gasps, soft at first, then louder, broke the silence. The reporter in the front row leaned forward, practically drooling now, itching to ask the question hanging in the air. He didn't even wait for me to call on him. Hand shot up. So what happened? He blurted out. What did you do to them? What did they do to you? I let myself smile dark, bitter. What did we do to them? I repeated softly. I leaned back from the podium a little, putting both hands flat on the cheap wood for balance. We thought we could control them, I said, my voice dropping even lower. We violated every rule of nature, every rule of ethics, spliced, cloned, augmented. We wanted them better, faster, stronger, for war, for profit, for power. I shook my head. The stuff in your movies, DNA, revolution. That was child's play. Primitive. These creatures. Crack of thunder outside. Lightning flashed. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died. The projector went black. The room plunged into shadow. This time the murmurs turned into a low rumble, uneasy. Someone whispered, way too loud. What the hell was that? They already know we're talking, I murmured to myself, waving a hand to quiet the crowd. Light show from the storm. That's all. But it wasn't just weather. Nothing tonight would be just weather or chance. They'd see, when we got to Alpha next. They wouldn't leave this room quite whole. The storm blurred in my memory as I shifted from the lecture hall back to 2008. The steel belly of the research vessel seemed to swell in my mind, cramped quarters, the faint smell of salt and machine grease in the air. This was where it started. The first living encounter. The grainy photo I'd shown, that pale, shriveled thing in the Mariana Trench, had been my first glimpse, a warning we'd ignored. But this was the next chapter, where it all took shape. The flashback wasn't clean, never was. It came in jagged pieces, dredged up from the deep time. The vessel had a name, though it barely registered anymore. Evangel. Or maybe Blue Horizon. Name didn't matter. What mattered was what we dragged up from the deep, encased in that reinforced tank in the center of our lab. That was the center of our fragile, fateful little world. Look at it. Dr. Ania Petrova was the first to say it. Her voice was thin, tight. She leaned close to the tank, one hand clamped around the stainless steel railing. She wasn't asking us to look. She was forcing us to face it, to reckon with the thing we'd fished out of the abyss. That thing suspended in the shimmering artificial seawater. It floated upright, uncomfortably still, like it had been waiting for us. The cold, clear glass showed every detail under the lab's bright lights. Reddish-gray skin stretched too tight over sharp bone ridges. Its arms, if you could call them that, hung at its sides like twisted branches, way too long, ending in claw-tipped fingers. The porous, leathery look of its skin made my stomach flip, like it was both rotting and alive at the same time. But even with all that, the claws, the ridges, the freaky alien body, it wasn't what stole my breath. It was the face. The predator's face. The skull-like shape stared right at me, those glassy, oversized eyes reflecting the light back like twin, unnerving mirrors. Those almond-shaped voids, they weren't meant to connect with you. They were meant to assess, to measure, to calculate. No emotion in that dead gaze. No joy, no sadness. Just a stillness that felt way more dangerous than any movement. We shouldn't call it a mermaid, Ben Carter said softly, breaking the silence. He was hunched over one of the consoles, logging data with the steady hands of a surgeon. It's deceptive. Deceptive. Ania spun around to face him, her Russian accent sharp. You think this is a branding problem, Ben? Look at it. I am looking, Ben replied calmly. But we have to think beyond the myths. This isn't a mermaid. This is... He gestured vaguely at the figure in the tank, its tail drifting faintly in the water, the pointed end scraping against the glass. A weaponized coil ending in a bone-plated barb. A predator, he finished. That's what it is. I could feel the truth of his words sink into the room, heavy as lead. Back then, we didn't know the full extent of what it could do. But even now, I could see that moment for what it was, the first crack in the foundation of our understanding. It's starving, Sarah Chen murmured from behind us. I turned to see her standing away from the group, Her green eyes locked on the creature like it was the first thing she'd ever seen. "Seen all predators starve," I said quietly. "That thing doesn't eat to sustain itself. It eats to survive." The words came out easier than I expected. They weren't new to me. Even then, I knew this wasn't just some rare, natural thing. The pale husk we'd found in the Mariana Trench had hinted at something older, something darker. But this creature, alive and right there in front of us, was something else entirely. This was designed, engineered. Even as it looked half dead, I could feel the weight of its purpose. This was no accident of evolution. This was what we had made. Next to me, Enya muttered something in Russian under her breath, her knuckles white as she gripped the railing. The creature's movements were tiny, careful. Its jaw twitched now and then, lips pulling back to show rows of serrated teeth tucked into its angular jaws. It was breathing, but even that was slow, like it was saving energy for something more important. Then it made its first sound. A low, guttural hum escaped its throat, just loud enough to ripple the water. It wasn't like whale clicks or dolphin songs. It was just noise stripped bare. No melody, no rhythm. Just a raw, feral vibration. But it didn't stop there. The hum stuttered, broke into bursts, guttural croaks turning into eerie murmurs. The sound echoed softly inside the tank, uneven, but definitely intentional. It was testing something, stabbing in the dark for meaning. Each note was sharp as a needle. It wasn't breathing anymore. It was babbling. Enya stepped back, startled. "What is it doing?" No one answered. Not even Ben, who suddenly looked more freaked out than I'd ever seen him. But Sarah tilted her head, stepping closer to the center console. Her fingers hovered over the volume control for the tank's underwater mic. "Is it trying to communicate?" "Don't touch anything," Enya snapped. Sarah ignored her. Her hand slipped forward, amplifying the sound through the speakers. Instantly, the air changed. The guttural hum got richer, layered with this icy vibration that went right through you. The distortion grew louder, faster. Something about it was mesmerizing. Rhythmic, in a way no natural ocean sound could be. Patterned, calculated. "It's mimicking us," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking with wonder and terror mixed together. "It's trying to copy sound," Enya spat, backing towards the far table. "Not mimicking. It is mocking. Do not humanize it. Do not pretend." The creature's head snapped around, suddenly, towards Enya. Muscles in its long neck twitched, grotesque. For the first time, it moved with purpose. "I think it understands pitch change," Ben said, his voice steady even as he scribbled like crazy. "Every time we shift our inflection, it recalibrates, dot." And then it hit me. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't just mimicry. This was intelligence. More than that, it was learning. The tank wasn't a prison. It was a classroom. And it was alpha. The submersible groaned, real low, its titanium frame creaking under the insane pressure of the Indian Ocean. Outside, the water was just a swirling mess of sediment, all stirred up from our dive into the black. Headlights cut through the dark, but they didn't reach far, just feeble beams in this total blackout. My breath rasped in my rebreather mask, damp and steady. Each exhale just hammering home how cut off we were. Way down inside the cabin, the air was stale, thick with the smell of machines and sweat. Cold seeped in through the metal walls, even though it was supposed to be insulated. Space was tight, a real metal coffin crammed with monitors and stuff, barely enough room for the three of us. Enya was on my left, eyes locked on the readouts in front of her, fingers clamped around the console, knuckles bone white, like she was holding on for dear life. Ben was to my right, posture all calm, eyes reflecting the faint green glow of the sonar screen. "Depth?" Enya's voice cut through the engine hum, clipped, neutral, but you could hear the tension underneath. She never looked at me when she spoke, always focused on the machines. 6,870 meters, Ben said, no hesitation. He leaned closer to his console, squinting at the sonar. "Approaching the trench wall." "This doesn't feel right," Enya muttered suddenly, fingers twitching on the console. She still didn't turn to us, gaze sharp on the data scrolling across her screen. The readings are off. Are you sure this is the site? Ben didn't even blink, didn't break his focus. Coordinates are correct, he said, fingers tapping at the display, precise, efficient. Everything lines up. We're following the grid exactly as planned. I leaned forward a bit, harness pulling against my shoulders, peering through the viewport. At first, just blackness. Nothing but dark, endless, heavy. Then, the lights started to pick out shapes, faint at first, blurry, curling out of the haze. And then, boom, the lights hit it full on. Ruins. Spread out across the sea below us. A whole mess of crumbled buildings and worn-down stone. Sediment was thick everywhere, like a pale shroud clinging to what was left of curved walls and pointy spires. Arches, that must have been perfect once, now just jutted up like broken ribs. Streets stretched out like veins across the ground, carved out by hands that were long gone. It's not a city, Anya breathed. It's a grave. "They're here," Ben said quietly, voice steady, but low, like speaking louder would break the silence. His eyes tracked the sonar, reading grids and patterns only he could understand. Anya leaned forward, hand almost touching the viewport, but she stopped herself. "This layout," she said, voice tight but still trying to sound analytical. "These structures, they're wrong. Disordered. This isn't what we expected." She cut herself off, breathed out, fogging the glass a little. "It's not erosion," I said, voice softer than I meant it to be. They both turned to me. I pointed towards the shadows scattered across what used to be streets. "Look." At first, the shapes looked random, just boulders half buried in silt. But as the light shifted, their shapes got clearer, too clear. Skulls, ribs, vertebrae, piles of bone twisted into these messed up heaps. Some were huge, monstrous shapes. Others were disturbingly human, like frames slumped against walls, sprawled on the ground, arms reaching out. "They didn't die in battle," Ben observed, his voice clinical. "No defensive positions, no signs of struggle. This wasn't war." But Enya's jaw tightened. "It's unnatural," she said finally, voice low, almost reluctant. "The positioning of the remains, the density, it's wrong. This is not normal decay. There's nothing normal about any of this." I added quietly. Ben's voice, calm as ever, pulled me back. "A pathogen," he said. "It's the most logical explanation. The scale of this, the clustering it fits. A disease spreading fast. No time to bury or burn the bodies." "They ran," I interrupted, the words just slipping out. Anya's eyes snapped to me, but I kept going. "They weren't just fleeing disease, Ben. They were fleeing something else, something bigger." "Bigger," Anya echoed, skeptical. "And what exactly do you think that something was?" I met her gaze. "Use," I said, just like that. "They were running from us." Her expression hardened, but she didn't snap back right away. Instead, she turned back to the viewport. Ben stayed quiet, hands hovering over the console. Attention split between the sonar and the ruins below. I pushed on. "How many experiments did we run? How much of their world did we mess with without even knowing or caring? We couldn't leave them alone. Not even when they tried to hide. Every time we reached into their world, we left something behind. Something they couldn't survive." For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence in the cabin was heavy, even heavier than the water outside. Anya shifted finally, hands curling into fists on her thighs. "If these remains predate our involvement," she said carefully, voice measured, cold, "then this isn't our fault. Their society could have collapsed on its own." "Could it?" I asked, but my voice was just tired, no anger in it. "Or did we weaken them way before we even knew they were there? Everything's connected, Anya. Doesn't take direct action to tip the balance. Sometimes, just being there is enough." Her lips parted a little, like she was going to argue, but no words came out. She just turned back to the viewport, shoulders stiff. Ben stayed still, focused, as the submersible drifted lower. The light swept over something half buried in the muck, a broken thing, coral and sediment stuck to it. Jagged, trident shaped, alien but familiar. My breath caught, mind scrambling to place it. But I didn't say anything. The dead didn't answer. They never would. The sample arrived in this totally ordinary steel canister, burnished, gleaming a bit under the lab lights. Hard to believe something so small, so normal-looking, could hold the key to total destruction. But nothing about this whole thing was harmless. Nothing was ordinary. The lab in Virginia was all about being sterile. White walls, white floors, white equipment. No warmth, no humanity. Even the air felt fake, scrubbed clean, replaced with that sharp, chemical smell of disinfectant. A low hum came from the vents overhead, so constant you couldn't tell if it was supposed to be calming or if it was driving you crazy. This was a place where nothing existed without a reason. A place that took pieces of you in exchange for knowledge. Dr. Sarah Chen stood to my left, gloved hands clasped tight behind her back. Her mouth was a thin, pale line, but her eyes were locked on something across the room, focused. One of her assistants was muttering data into a recorder, voice tight with nerves. The other techs moved around quietly, their whispers lost in the steady beep of the monitors. Center of the room, the reinforced microscope station, triple layered, surrounded by screens. The steel canister sat on a stainless steel counter nearby, all these tubes and wires connecting it to the station. Inside that plain container, cloudy, messed up-looking liquid, the last bit of specimen alpha. The creature from the deep. It had been alive when we first found it, this unbelievable discovery. But then it died in containment just like that, and any ideas we had about being in control. Gone. The autopsy that followed, that's when we found out what we were really dealing with. Sarah breathed out sharp through her nose, breaking the silence. "I'll start with the basics," she said, voice clinical, but with this tiny tremor in it. "What you're looking at is wastewater, extracted straight from specimen alpha's body during the autopsy. First thing we noticed, crazy anomalies in its biochemistry. Almost right away." She said biochemistry like it was a curse word. Unusually high concentrations of unidentified microorganisms in its tissue and bloodstream. At first, we thought environment, deep sea contaminant. Something it adapted to. Her hands tightened on the counter edge, gloves creaking softly. But it wasn't external, she went on. These microorganisms they'd integrated into its physiology. They weren't just there. They were dominant. She stepped aside, gesturing to the monitors. Magnified images filled the screens. Spindly threads, blobs of nuclei, jagged shapes that looked more like machine parts than biology. They swirled around in these faded, rotten colors, browns and greens, like decay blooming under glass. "This is the organism," Sarah said, voice getting softer now. "It invades host cells fast. Doesn't just feed off the host, it restructures it." I stared at the images, these gross shapes shifting in front of me. "Restructures," I repeated. Sarah's jaw tightened. "You've seen it before," she said, voice dropping even lower, almost like she didn't want to say it. "On the vessel. The way Alpha's tissue warped. How its body seemed to pulse, like it was rotting from the inside out. That wasn't natural. That was this." She nodded towards the canister. I remembered Alpha. Leathery skin, bones sticking out. But also, that intelligence in its eyes. And then I remembered the ruins under the sea, from the submersible. Crumbled buildings, scattered skeletons. We'd guessed back then, wondered what could wipe out a whole civilization like that. Now, the ruins, I murmured. The Mermaids, their civilization. You're saying this thing killed them? Sarah didn't answer right away, jaw tight, glancing at the liquid in the canister. The remains we found in those ruins wasn't just a graveyard. It was evidence of an infection. Scale we hadn't even thought about. This parasite doesn't just kill, it spreads. And once it takes hold, there's no going back. I swallowed hard. "And you're saying this organism is responsible?" "Yes," Sarah admitted. "It's a parasite, but unlike anything we've seen. It attacks structural proteins, rewrites them cellular level. Once cells are changed, they follow program behavior. It erases thought. Autonomy reduces its host's toe. Husks. I finished for her. The word hung in the room, harsh, brittle. Sarah turned away, shoulders stiff. We've named it Meridon Omega, she said after a pause. Specimen Alpha wasn't just a host. It was an ecosystem, an incubator for this thing. What about us? My voice cracked a little. Are we safe? Or are you about to tell me it's already here? Or are you about to tell me it's already here? A voice cut in, sharp, commanding. I spun around. Agent Carter stepped into the lab. Tailored suit, government pin, everything polished, perfect. But his eyes were cold, intense. The click of his shoes on the tile floor was deafening in the sterile quiet. Carter's eyes locked on mine. We've detected isolated samples in quarantined coastal water, he said. Chesapeake Bay, South Carolina, Washington State. Teams are working around the clock to ensure containment. Containment. I echoed. You mean the same containment that lets fish wash up covered in slime? No one's lying to you, Dr. Harlow, Carter snapped, folding his arms. We've sacrificed entire fisheries to keep this from spreading. There hasn't been a single case beyond the coastline. For now. For now. I shot back. Sarah stepped between us, voice tight. Infection patterns are still under study, Agent Carter. She cut in. We don't know if it'll evolve new transmission vectors. That word, if hung in the air. Carter's glare hardened. But it wasn't his words I was scared of. It was the silence that followed. What's next? I demanded. Rivers? Wells? Do we even get a warning before it starts boiling out of the water supply? Carter's jaw tightened. That won't happen, he hissed. Because failure isn't an option. But I saw it in his face. The same fear that was eating at me. Agent Mitchell Carter, for all his tough talk, had no clue how to stop this. And for the first time since I got dragged into this whole mess, I realized I didn't believe anyone did. The ice was biting at my face, even through my mask and scarf. Antarctica had this way of just reminding you that you were an outsider, that you didn't belong. The wind howled across the frozen wasteland, tearing at every bit of exposed skin. Visibility was this gray, white blur, like nothingness itself, making you wonder where the ground stopped and the sky started. Only the GPS in my hand kept us tethered to reality, leading us deeper into the emptiness. We came here chasing answers, the kind we couldn't find in any lab. The parasite, Meridon Omega, had already flipped everything we knew about biology and infection upside down. Its trick of rewriting hosts at a cellular level, turning them into these grotesque puppets, was horrifying enough. But those burial sites we found a few months back, after the ice melt, showed these faint glows that promised something way worse. A history, a blueprint, a warning. We already knew the infection wiped out the Mermaid civilization, their underwater cities turned to ruins. What we didn't know was how, or why. To figure it all out, we needed to understand the link between the parasite and those burial sites. Between the parasite and whatever else was buried down here. The progenitor, that was the key. Behind me, Anya trudged in silence, bundled up in her cold weather gear. Even layered up like I was, the cold was gnawing at my fingers through my gloves, sharp and insistent. Ben brought up the rear, his breathing steady, humming quietly through the comms in our helmets. Antarctica had shut us all up, one way or another. Coordinates should update in 60 meters. Ben's voice crackled in my earpiece. Finally. He sounded as calm here as he did back in the lab. I glanced down at the tablet strapped to my arm. The map showed us going downhill, steep ridges leading down. The burial site was right below us, buried deep in the glacier. Not a sight. Anya's voice cut through the static. A tum. We were slowing down. I turned to see her gesturing back at Ben, who'd stopped to check the sled behind him. Reinforced steel, carrying our digging gear and emergency supplies. Anya's eyes narrowed, always calculating. "We can't afford delays," she said, her Russian accent clipped. "The storm will catch us if we hesitate." Ben nodded, adjusting the sled ropes on his shoulders. I tightened my grip on the GPS and pushed on. The ground sloped sharply here, and the ice under our spikes groaned ominous. We hadn't come this far through storms, red tape, sleepless nights, shrinking budgets to turn back now. By the time we reached the edge, I was breathing hard, ragged breaths. The drop off was brutal, steep, slick, unforgiving. But what was at the bottom that stopped us dead? The ice glowed. In the dim, eternal twilight of the Antarctic desert, sections of the glacier ahead were radiating this faint violet light, seeping through the thick ice. Vast ridges stretched out in every direction, and buried deep inside them were forms. Humanoid forms. Thousands. We'd seen photos of the burial sites, sure. But nothing prepared you for this. The sheer scale of it. Back in Geneva, the lab had analyzed bits of that glowing ice, traced it back to the parasite's weird metabolism. But standing here, surrounded by the dead, it hit you hard. This wasn't just a graveyard. It was a last stand. They did this deliberately, Ania said, voice low, even. She crouched near the ice, brushing frost off a shallow ridge where one of the figures was clearest. The positioning. The depth. This wasn't random. They entombed themselves to contain the parasite, Ben added, crouching beside her, gloved hand tracing the faint violet veins in the ice. They must have known what would happen if it spread beyond them. This whole site, it's a quarantine. I forced myself to stay focused, and yet it still wasn't enough. The glacier groaned under our boots, a low, mournful sound. Centuries of ice shifting had already started to expose some of the bodies. Grotesque shapes, warped in ways that made your stomach churn. Leathery tails curled at wrong angles, hands twisted like claws. Not fighting, not running, just frozen in place. Mouths open in silent death. The violet glow got stronger as we went deeper into the expanse. The bodies got bigger, more messed up. They strained against the ice, thickened. Stringy forms, all warped by whatever horrors the parasite had put them through. Sail, like spines jutted from their backs, flesh caught mid-twist, like they'd been changing right as they died. And then we saw it. The glacier opened into this huge cavern. And at the very heart of it, a figure that broke your brain. It wasn't in the ice like the others. It was the ice. This massive, bloated form stretched across the cavern, grotesquely swollen, fused into the glacier itself. Flesh folded and bunched, merging with the ice crystals. Translucent skin pulsed faintly, veins bursting into fractal patterns underneath. Monstrous limbs, thick and deformed, spread across the violet glacier, clawing at the frozen walls like it was trying to dig itself out, or maybe deeper in. Ben spoke first, voice barely a whisper. The progenitor. This wasn't a parasite. This was the host, the first one. Its messed up, overgrown body was proof of what the infection could do if it went wild, unchecked. A living, evolutionary dead end. And yet near the base of its decaying form, something sharp caught the light. The faint glow from the glacier lit up the edges of smooth, metallic plating. Dull with age, but definitely manufactured. Blinking lights winked faintly from the seams, fighting against the crushing frost. It's not theirs, Ania said sharply, eyes locked on the machine. That's human. Government, maybe. Or something we weren't supposed to find. Ben knelt beside it, brushing frost off the surface. It's signaling. The word hit me hard. My breath caught as I stared at the blinking lights, that faint hum vibrating up through the ice. And we all thought the same terrible thing. If it was signaling, who or what was listening? The shaky hum of the machine filled the makeshift Antarctic base, constant and unnerving. It fought against the wind howling outside, barely winning. Every now and then, the dodgy generator powering the device would cough, and the overhead lights would flicker. The lab wasn't much, smelled of antiseptic and sweat. Metal tables scattered with half-empty thermoses, and tools too frozen to be useful. But it was warm-ish. Alive, at least for now. We'd stripped down as much as the cold would let us. Parkas thrown over chairs, gloves in messy piles, boots lined up by the door. But the chill still seeped through the walls. My bones ached. Skin screamed for sleep, but the machine yet demanded our attention. Ben was kneeling beside it, gloved hands working carefully on a mess of wires and adapters from a field kit. The device sat in the middle of the table, smooth, frost-kissed plating catching the dim light. My eyes kept going back to it, to those faint pulses blinking under the ice-scratched surface. They reminded me way too much of what we'd seen in the glacier. The progenitor, entombed yet twitching. It's doing more than signaling now, Ben murmured, not looking up. His breath fogged the scratched up tablet propped next to the device. When we found it out there, it was just broadcasting a low-frequency pulse. But whatever we did earlier, he paused, fiddling with a connection. It's like we woke it up. This isn't just a signal anymore. It's active. Enya paced behind him, boots crunching on the bits of metal showing through the ice-covered floor. She stopped after every few steps, sharp gaze snapping back to the machine between us. It was fused to the progenitor, she said, more to herself than anyone else. Could it have been dormant because of that? Hibernating alongside it until we intervened? Dud it, Ben replied, still not looking up, fingers dancing over exposed ports. The signals we picked up earlier were definitely from this device. It was already broadcasting when we found it. But now it's responding directly to us, like it recognizes we're here. He hesitated. That's what worries me. It's human-made, Enya snapped, crossing her arms. Government, you said. Military. Definitely tech we didn't leave behind, I said, thinking out loud. Too advanced for anything early on, and that plating looks like some kind of stealth material. Stealth. Enya's eyebrows went up. Why would you need stealth down there? Unless... Ben finally looked up, pushing his goggles onto his forehead. He looked at Enya, then at me, a slow dawning in his eyes. Unless someone else is down here, someone we don't know about. The generator caught again, lights flickered, throwing jumpy shadows across the lab. The wind howled louder now, like it was trying to tear the whole base apart. And in the middle of it all, that machine hummed, blinked, sending out something. And we had no idea who or what was listening. We need to shut it down, Enya said, decisive. No. She started towards the table, hand reaching for the power cable. Wait, Ben yelled, lunging forward, grabbing her arm. Don't. We don't know what happens if we just cut it off. Could trigger something. Damage the data. Enya stared at him like he was crazy. Ben, are you serious? We're talking about who knows what responding to this thing. Data is the least of our worries. But what if? Ben argued, voice tight with urgency. What if there's something in that signal? Information about the progenitor. About them. We came all this way for answers, Enya. We can't just risk losing everything because we're spooked. Spooked. Enya practically spat the word. We are sitting on top of a frozen goddamn monster, in the middle of nowhere, with a machine that's probably broadcasting our location to everything in a 100-mile radius, and you're worried about data. We can analyze the signal. Ben insisted, ignoring her anger. Figure out what it's doing, maybe even control it. Control it. I echoed, and this time it was my turn to sound skeptical. Ben, seriously. Control. We thought we could control Alpha, remember? How'd that work out? He flinched, just a little, but he didn't back down. This is different. This is technology. We understand technology. We can work with this. Or it can work with us, Enya countered, pulling her arm free. And I'm not willing to take that chance. We shut it down. Now. She reached for the power cable again. This time, Ben didn't stop her. He just stepped back, watching, face grim. Enya's hand closed around the thick black cable. She hesitated for a split second, looking at the blinking lights on the machine, then back at Ben, then at me. Then, she yanked. The hum cut off, just like that. Silence slammed into the lab, so sudden, so complete it was deafening. The wind still howled outside, the generator still cawed. But the machine, it was dead. The blinking lights went dark. The humming stopped. Nothing. We stood there, frozen for what felt like forever, staring at the silent machine, waiting, listening, for something, anything. The only sound was the wind. We stood there, just waiting. The silence after the machine shut off was heavy, like the air itself had thickened. The wind still screamed outside, rattling the walls of the base, but inside it was like holding your breath. We were all just staring at that dead machine, that cold, silent piece of metal in the middle of the table. Minutes stretched out. Nothing happened. No alarms blared, no lights flashed. The ice under our feet didn't crack open, no monsters burst out of the glacier. Just silence. And the wind. Enya let out a slow breath, finally. "Well," she said, voice still tight, but a little less strained. Maybe that was it." Ben didn't say anything, just kept staring at the machine, like he expected it to suddenly jump back to life. I couldn't blame him. I was half expecting it too. This whole thing had been one jump scare after another. What was one more? "Ben," Enya prompted, a little sharper this time. "Anything." He shook his head slowly, still looking at the machine. "No," he said, voice quiet. "No signal. No change in anything." He ran a hand over his face, pushing his goggles back up onto his forehead again. Maybe you were right. Maybe it was just a signal. And now it's off." "Maybe," Enya repeated, but she didn't sound convinced. Neither was I. It felt too easy. Like we'd just defused a bomb by clipping the right wire, and that was that. But nothing about this whole mess had been easy. "We should still analyze the data we got," Ben said, finally turning away from the machine. He went back to his tablet, fingers flying over the screen. "See if we can figure out what it was broadcasting, who it was talking to, and then what?" Enya asked, arms still crossed tight. "Even if we know, what does it change? We still have a frozen monster under our feet, a parasite spreading in the ocean, and governments covering it all up. It changes something." Ben insisted, still focused on his tablet. "Knowledge is something, right?" He looked up at us, a flicker of that old scientific hope in his eyes. The hope that had gotten us all into this mess in the first place. I sighed, rubbing my tired eyes. "Yeah, knowledge is something, Ben. But sometimes it's just another kind of nightmare." I looked around the lab, at the frost creeping up the walls, the flickering lights, the silent machine. We'd come here chasing answers, and we'd found them, all right. Answers we probably should have left buried in the ice. Answers that didn't bring any comfort, any hope. Just more fear, more questions. And the heavy, sickening feeling that we were way out of our depth. Back in the lecture hall, the lights flickered back on, the projector sputtered, and the grainy image of that first corpse in the Mariana Trench blinked back onto the screen. The uneasy murmurs in the room started up again, louder this time, buzzing with a different kind of energy. Fear, yeah, but also excitement. Morbid curiosity. They wanted to know more. They always did. The reporter in the front row was practically vibrating, hand still raised. "So," he said, voice eager, "what about now? What happens now?" I looked out at their faces, those rows of shimmering, unblinking eyes. They wanted a story, a headline, something to post online and forget by tomorrow. But they wouldn't forget this. Not really. Not if I did my job right. I took a breath, straightened up behind the podium again. "What happens now?" I repeated, my voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "No, we brace ourselves." And then I kept talking. I told them everything. The nightmares we'd found in the deep, the parasite, the cover-up, the frozen cities, the machine in the ice. All of it. I didn't hold back. I didn't sugarcoat it. I just told them the truth that destroys. And as I spoke, I could see the fascination in their eyes slowly turning into something else. Something colder. Something real. Fear. Yeah. Fear was their shield. But maybe it could be something else too. Maybe it could be a warning. Maybe, just maybe, it could be enough to make them listen. Before it was too late. Because down in the dark, In the silent depths of the ocean, and frozen in the ice of Antarctica, they weren't gone. They were just waiting. And we had just woken them up.